There are towns in the American West where a woman's patience becomes the town's quiet legend. Not because she announces it, not because she performs it, but because everyone can see it in the way she turns down every reasonable offer, in the way her eyes settle on one particular person with the kind of steady, unhurried certainty that most people spend their whole lives looking for and never find. In Harlow Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1889, that woman was Delia Forsythe. She was 29 years old, the daughter of the town's only veterinarian, which meant she had grown up knowing how to be calm around things that were in pain and how to wait without making the waiting obvious. She had dark brown hair she wore in a loose braid during work hours and down on Sunday mornings, and a way of listening to people that made them feel, afterward, that they had said something worth hearing. She was precise without being cold, capable without being hard, and she had, for reasons the town had been speculating about for the better part of 4 years, declined every man who had asked. There had been a cattle buyer from Billings who sent flowers for 2 weeks before asking. A recently widowed judge who approached her father first, formally, with documents. A rancher named Prescott, who had 300 head and no outstanding debts, and who had genuinely seemed like the kind of man a sensible woman would consider. Delia had turned each of them down with such careful kindness that none of them could quite find it in themselves to be angry about it, which somehow made it worse. People had theories. She was too educated for Harlow Creek. She had grief in her that hadn't finished working itself out. She was waiting for someone from back east, someone her father had mentioned once at dinner, who had never materialized. None of the theories were right. The truth was considerably simpler and considerably more inconvenient than any of them. It had a name, the way most inconvenient truths do. The name was Silas Croft, and he was the only man in Harlow Creek who had never once thought to try. What no one knew, including Silas, was that the window was beginning to close. Silas Croft was 32 years old and ran the grain and feed supply on the north end of Harlow Creek's main road. He was not the most prosperous man in town. He was not the most polished. He had broad shoulders from a decade of loading stock, a face that was more honest than handsome, and the particular kind of patience that comes from working with farmers who are perpetually waiting on weather they cannot control. Other men described him as reliable, which is either the highest compliment or a gentle dismissal, depending on who's saying it and why. What Silas Croft was, without question, was decent, not in the self-congratulatory way, in the quiet way. He remembered what people needed before they asked. He gave fair weight on the scale and never adjusted it for people he didn't like. When the Fenwick family lost their harvest 2 years running, he extended their credit without announcing it, and when they paid him back the following spring, he thanked them like they'd done him a favor. He and Delia had grown up in neighboring households, their fathers the kind of friends who borrowed tools and returned them without being asked. They had known each other so long and so easily that Silas had never once thought to look at her the way the cattle buyer had looked at her, or the judge, or Prescott with his 300 head. She was Delia. She had always been Delia. He looked at her the way you look at something that has always been part of your landscape, aware that it's there, glad that it is, and somehow never registering that you could walk toward it and it would still be there when you arrived. He came into her father's office on a Thursday morning in September to ask about a lame draft horse, and found her reorganizing the medicine cabinet while her father was out on a call. She was standing on a low stool, sleeves rolled up, reading labels with the focused attention of someone who takes even small tasks seriously. "Morning, Delia," he said, the way he'd said it 100 times. "Morning, Silas," she said, the way she'd answered 100 times. He explained about the horse. She gave him a poultice recipe and told him to rest the animal for a week. He thanked her. He left. Outside on the road, Frank Allard, who had himself been declined by Delia 2 years prior and had since acquired a philosophical attitude about it, watched Silas walk out and shook his head with the slow certainty of a man who has been watching the same scene repeat itself too many times. "You know," Frank said, falling into step beside him, "for a man who deals in things people need, you have a remarkable talent for not recognizing one when it's right in front of you." Silas looked at him, genuinely puzzled. "What are you talking about?" Frank looked at the sky. "Nothing," he said, "not a thing." But Frank was thinking about something Silas didn't know yet, that a man named Leonard Hatch had ridden into Harlow Creek 3 days ago. Hatch was a land attorney from Helena, 40 years old, with a proper education and a reputation for knowing which way things were headed. He was passing through on business, or so he said, but he had taken supper at the Forsythe house twice already, and Delia's mother had been using the good dishes. The autumn social was held in the grain barn behind the feed store, Silas's barn as it happened, on the second Saturday of October. The irony of that was not lost on anyone paying attention. Delia came in a wool dress the color of pine needles, her hair done properly with the composed expression of a woman who has gotten very good at being present in rooms she did not particularly choose. The invitations to dance came quickly. She accepted some because refusing was its own kind of disruption, and moved through the evening with the attentive warmth she gave most things. Leonard Hatch arrived an hour in, dressed better than anyone else in the room, with the easy confidence of a man who has always been the most educated person available. He was not unkind, he was simply deliberate, in the way of men who have decided something and are working methodically toward it. He asked Delia to dance. She accepted because declining in a room this size would have created exactly the kind of scene she avoided. He was a good dancer. He was also watching her with a careful, assessing attention, not disrespectful, just precise, like a man calculating a fair price on something he intended to acquire. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly and without showing it. Across the room, Silas had arrived late, slightly dusty, and accepted a cup of cider from the refreshment table with the comfortable ease of a man who has hosted enough events in his barn that they no longer impress him. He watched Delia dancing with Hatch and thought, vaguely, that she looked like she was being evaluated. She caught his eye across the room and smiled. Not the public smile she'd been wearing all evening, but the other one. The quick, private one she'd been giving him since they were children, there and gone before anyone could place it. He smiled back. Then one of his suppliers appeared at his elbow wanting to discuss a winter order, and Silas turned his attention elsewhere with the oblivious ease of a man who has no idea what he just walked away from. Delia watched him turn away. Then she looked back at Leonard Hatch, who was watching her with that careful, deliberate attention. And she felt, for the first time, something she had not let herself feel before. The cold edge of a possibility she had spent 4 years refusing to consider, that waiting might eventually cost her more than it was worth. 3 days after the social, Delia was working in the garden when her father came and sat on the back steps and said, without preamble, "Hatch came by the office yesterday." She kept working. "He has good standing," her father said. "Property in Helena, a practice that's doing well." A pause. "He asked about your situation, whether you had any particular attachments." Delia's hand slowed on the soil. "I told him you made your own decisions," her father said. "Which is true." He looked at her. "I just thought you should know that he is the kind of man who, once he decides something, doesn't undecide it. He'll make a formal ask before he leaves, maybe within the week." Delia sat back on her heels. The garden was quiet. The first hard frost had browned the edges of things, and the mountains beyond the valley had their earliest snow on the high peaks. "Papa," she said. "Yes." "Do you know why I've said no to every man who's asked?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "I've had a thought or two about it." "It's Silas." Her father nodded once, like a man who has known something for a long time and was waiting for it to be said aloud. "He doesn't see it," she said. "I've waited 4 years and he—" She stopped. Started again. "He looks at me like I've always just been there, like something he's so used to that he stopped noticing." She turned the trowel over her hands. "I don't know if that's ever going to change." Her father was quiet for a while. "Hatch is a reasonable man," Delia said, and her voice was level. "He's thoughtful. He'd treat a woman well." A pause. "If Silas doesn't—" "How long are you willing to wait?" her father asked gently. She looked at the mountains. those distant, snow-touched peaks that had always been there, that no one in town ever thought to actually climb. "Not much longer," she said quietly. It was the first time she had said it, and entirely meant it. Frank Allard found Silas at the grain store on a Monday morning and told him directly, without softening it, that Leonard Hatch was going to make a formal proposal to Delia Forsythe before the end of the week. Silas was checking a ledger. He didn't look up right away. "Where did you hear that?" "From Delia's mother," Frank said, "who mentioned it to my wife, who mentioned it to me this morning at breakfast. There is no version of that chain where it isn't true." Silas set down his pen. He looked at Frank. Frank leaned against the counter with the patience of a man who has been waiting a long time for this particular conversation. "Silas," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to actually think before you answer." "Go ahead." "In 4 years, how many men have asked Delia Forsythe to dance?" Silas thought about it. "Plenty." "And how many has she said yes to for more than one dance?" Silas opened his mouth, closed it. "And of all the men who've asked her properly, the Billings buyer, Prescott the judge, and now Hatch, how many times has she given any of them the kind of smile she gives you when you walk into a room?" The grain store was very quiet. Outside, someone drove a wagon slowly past on the road. "She's never," Silas started. "She has been," Frank said, simply. "For years. She has been, Silas, and you have been standing right in the middle of it and calling it nothing." He straightened up. "Hatch is leaving Friday. Before he does, he will ask, and she will have to answer." He picked up his hat from the counter. "I've said what I came to say." He left. Silas stood in the grain store for a long time after that. The kind of stillness that comes over a man when something he thought was fixed turns out to have been moving the whole time, just too slowly for him to notice. 4 years. He thought about every morning she had come in for feed for her father's horses, every conversation at the social and the church picnic and the Hendersons' back porch, every time she had smiled at him in that particular way and he had simply received it, the way you receive sunlight, without thinking about what it cost. He thought about Hatch in his good clothes, deliberate and decided. He set down the ledger. It happened the following afternoon, Wednesday. Delia was walking back from the post office when she passed the grain store, and Silas was outside repairing a broken hinge on the loading door, sleeves rolled to the elbows, working with a careful, unhurried precision that characterized most of what he did. She stopped. Because she always stopped, because any ordinary moment with him was, to her, better than a carefully arranged evening with someone else. They talked, the weather turning, the Whitman family's new mule, whether the creek trail would be passable before first snow. Ordinary things, in the easy language of people who have been talking to each other their whole lives. Then Silas set down his tools and looked at her. Not the casual, habitual look of long familiarity. Something else. Something she hadn't seen before, with an urgency behind it. Like a man who has been walking calmly and has just realized the ground ahead ends sooner than he thought. He took a breath. "I know about Hatch," he said. She went still. "I know he's going to ask you before he leaves, and I know I have no standing to say anything about it, because I've never given you any reason to think I would." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "But I need to say something to you before you make any decisions, and I need you to hear it as what it actually is, not as, I'm not being sorry for myself here. I'm not asking you to wait anymore. I'm just—" He stopped, started again, more quietly. "I've been looking at you my whole life without understanding what I was looking at, and I think—" Another pause, shorter. "I know I love you. I think I have for a long time, and I called it something else because it seemed impossible, because you're Delia Forsythe and I run a grain store, and those two facts seemed like the end of the conversation." He met her eyes. "I was wrong about that. I know I was wrong about that. But I'd rather tell you now and have it be too late than let you think nobody in this town actually sees you." The road was quiet around them. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. Delia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, low and even and certain, Silas Croft, I've been waiting for 4 years for you to say something exactly like that. He blinked. I turned down the Billings man because I couldn't stop thinking about you. I turned down Prescott because I kept comparing him to you and it wasn't fair to either of us. She held his gaze without wavering. Hatch is a fine man. He would have been a sensible choice. A pause. But I don't want a sensible choice. I've been keeping myself for the right one, and the right one has been standing in front of me since I was old enough to know the difference. Her voice didn't waver, but something in her eyes did, just slightly, the first sign of how long she'd been carrying it. Don't make me say it twice, she said quietly, and don't make me wait anymore. Silas Croft, who had spent 32 years standing beside something extraordinary and calling it ordinary, took one step toward her. He went to her father's house the next morning. Clean shirt, combed hair. The expression of a man who has made a decision in the night and arrived at morning with it still intact, which is the only real test of a decision. Dr. Forsythe was at his desk when Silas came in. He looked at Silas, at the shirt, at the expression, and said nothing for a moment. Then he called toward the back of the house, "Delia, Silas Croft is here." Footsteps on the wooden floor, and then she came through the doorway and stopped, and the look on her face was different from every other expression she'd worn for 4 years in public. No careful patience, no managed composure. Just, "You came." "I'd like permission to call on Delia properly," Silas said to her father, but loud enough that she could hear it clearly. "Starting today, and going forward for as long as she'll have me." Dr. Forsythe found something extremely interesting to read on his desk. "You have it," he said without looking up. Delia leaned against the doorframe. "You know," she said, "most men who come calling think to bring something." Silas looked at his empty hands. "I'll bring something tomorrow." "Is there going to be a tomorrow?" "Everyone I've got," he said, "for as long as you want them." She looked at him for a moment with the clear, steady gaze she gave things she was sure of. "Then don't be late," she said. What followed was the most discussed courtship in Harlow Creek's recent memory, which is saying something for a town that had been watching the situation with undisguised interest for 4 years. He brought wild flowers the next day, not from a shop, just found and picked along the creek trail, slightly imperfect and entirely genuine. And she put them in a blue jar on the windowsill without explaining them to anyone, which generated exactly the kind of speculation she found privately amusing. He came to Sunday supper. Her mother made the good pie. Her father was warm in the quiet, relieved way of a man whose long wait had also just ended. Delia sat across from Silas, and they talked the way they always had, easily, with the particular humor of people who have been ribbing each other since childhood, except that now neither of them was pretending it was nothing. On a Saturday in November, he drove her out to the ridge above the valley, where the whole county spread below in the clear, cold air. They sat on a flat rock with a blanket across their knees and talked about real things. Not weather, not horses, real things. "Why me?" he asked with the genuine puzzlement of a man still catching up. Hatch was educated, Prescott had. Silas. "I'm serious." "So am I." She looked at the valley below, the river catching light in the far distance. "Every man who came along was showing me something. His land, his money, his credentials, like they were each making a case." She paused. "You never made a case. You just showed up, the same every time, and were exactly who you were and never once tried to be more impressive than you actually are." She looked at him. "Do you have any idea how rare that is?" He was quiet. "Hatch was impressive," she said. "Genuinely. I'm not dismissing that." A pause. "But impressive isn't the same as known. And I've known you my whole life, Silas. Every part of you. There were no surprises to survive." She turned to look at him directly. "I chose you because you were the real thing and I knew it, not because you were the only option." He was quiet for a long time after that. Below them, Harlow Creek sat small and specific and real in the November light, and the mountains did what they always did, patient and enormous. And there. I wasted 4 years, he said finally. We wasted 4 years, she corrected, without heat. I could have said something sooner. I chose not to. She looked at him. I wanted you to find it yourself. Why? A pause. Because I wanted you to mean it. He looked at her, at this woman who had held something quietly and intact for 4 years, without bitterness, without breaking, and had offered it to him without conditions when he finally showed up, and he felt the specific, particular gratitude of a man who understands, clearly and completely, what almost didn't happen. He asked her in December, on the steps of the church after the choir practice she helped organize every year. He had his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket, a thin gold band he'd cleaned with a cloth every night for 2 weeks while he waited for a moment that felt honest. She came down the steps and he stopped her, and she looked at him and already knew. He could see that she knew. Delia, he said, I've been unclear for years and you have been patient with that in a way I don't entirely deserve. I want to stop being unclear. A pause. I love you. I have loved you, and I would like very much, if you're willing, for you to be my wife. I know I was slow. I'm trying to make up for it. But I want you to know that I know, clearly, with no confusion left, that there is no version of my life I want that doesn't have you in it. She looked at him in the cold December air. That was almost romantic, she said. Almost. The last part was genuinely good. I practiced it. A pause. The cold was sharp, and the church behind them was still lit from inside, a warm yellow against the dark. Yes, she said quietly, finally after 4 years of waiting for the right man to ask the right question. Yes. He put his grandmother's ring on her finger on the church steps, and she looked at it the way you look at something you have been expecting to arrive for a very long time. They were married in January, between the hard snows in a church so full that Frank Allard had to stand in the doorway. Half of Harlow Creek felt with complete justification that they had personally seen this coming and had earned their place at the celebration. Leonard Hatch, to his credit, had sent a brief, gracious note from Helena when he heard, which said he wished them well and which Delia kept in the small box where she kept things worth keeping. Silas stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle and felt the full weight of 4 years pressing against the present moment. How many mornings he had walked past the real thing and catalogued it as familiar. How close Hatch had come to being the reason she stopped waiting. How one more week of his own oblivious certainty that she was simply there and always would be might have changed the whole shape of everything. He was not going to spend another day unaware of it. They said their vows in plain language. They meant all of it. The years after were good years, built steadily from the kind of foundation that holds because both people in it are paying attention. The grain store grew. Delia kept the accounts and discovered within the first 6 months that Silas had been undercharging half the town on principle, which she corrected with the practical efficiency of a woman raised in a household that ran on careful margins. He didn't argue. He had learned quickly that on questions of number and sense, Delia was right more often than not, and that admitting this cost him nothing. Their first child arrived in the 2nd year, a daughter they named Ivy, who had Silas's patience and her mother's habit of noticing things no one else had mentioned yet. Their son came in the 4th year, a boy named August, loud and cheerful and constitutionally unable to sit still for more than 3 minutes, who made the house considerably louder and gave the dog someone worthy to run with. On a summer evening in their 7th year, Delia was in the side yard hanging wash when Silas came home from the store and stopped at the gate and just stood there. She had her back to him. She was humming, a low, tuneless thing she did when she was absorbed in something. The light was long and gold the way it gets in late July. The mountains were doing what they always did. She turned and saw him. "You're staring again," she said. "I know. You do that more than you used to." "I didn't know what I was looking at before," he said. "I'm making up for the time." She smiled, not the public one, the other one, and came toward him across the yard, and he met her there and held her in the evening light while August's voice came hollering from somewhere inside the house about something that required immediate adult attention. "Don't go in yet," she said against his shoulder. "I won't," he said. "Not yet." The summer evening settled around them. The mountains stood where they always had, and Silas Croft held his wife and thought about Frank Allard in the grain store that Monday morning, and about Leonard Hatch riding out of Harlow Creek with his gracious note already written in his mind, and about how close everything had come to being a different story entirely. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "I see you," he said quietly. She didn't ask what he meant. She had always known. She had just been waiting, patiently and without making waiting obvious, for him to finally know it too. Years later, when Ivy was old enough to be curious about such things, she asked her mother about it in the way children ask hard questions, sideways, in the middle of something else, while they were sitting together on the porch watching the evening come in. "How did you know," Ivy asked, "that Papa was the right one?" Before he knew it himself. Delia was quiet for a while, watching the light change on the mountains. "He never tried to be anything other than what he was," she said finally. "Every other man who came along was presenting himself, showing me the best version, the most impressive version." She paused. "Your father just showed up, same every time. Good days and difficult ones, never performed, never managed it." She looked at her daughter. "When you've seen a person in every light there is, and you still want to move toward them, that's not a decision. That's just the truth." Ivy thought about this. "But you almost didn't wait long enough. Because of the man from Helena." "Yes," Delia said honestly, "almost." They watched the mountains in the quiet. "That's what I want you to remember," Delia said. "Not the happy ending, though that part is good, the almost." She turned to look at Ivy directly. "Know what you want. Don't talk yourself into settling because waiting is uncomfortable. But don't wait passively either. Live your life, be yourself completely, and when the moment comes where you understand that something true needs to be said, say it. A pause. Give the person a real chance to show up, not a hint, not a door left open a crack, the true thing said plainly. And if they don't show up," Delia was quiet for a moment, "then you know, and you move forward, and you do it without bitterness, because bitterness is just waiting with the door locked." She covered Ivy's hand with hers. "But Ivy, in my experience, when you say the true thing clearly, to the right person, at the right moment," she smiled, "they show up." Delia Forsythe had waited, but she had not waited the way people imagine waiting. She had not put her life in a box and sat beside it. She had worked and laughed and argued and been, every single day, entirely herself. She had lived fully in every direction except the one she was quietly holding open. And when the time came, when she understood that the window was closing and she had a choice to make, she had said the true thing on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon and walked away without waiting to see what happened next. That is not a small thing. That took more courage than everything Silas did, and he did not do nothing in the end. He is not a villain in the story. He is something more recognizable than that. He is a man who is so thoroughly convinced that something wonderful was simply not available to him that he never once thought to ask. And sometimes that is what it takes, not the discovery of love, because that had been there all along, but the sudden, undeniable understanding that what you have been taking for granted is not, in fact, guaranteed to remain. They chose each other clearly and deliberately and at almost the last possible moment, but still in time. And that is the part worth holding on to. I keep coming back to that Wednesday afternoon on the road outside the grain store, an ordinary day. Two people who had known each other their whole lives, standing in the dust, and one of them finally saying the thing that had been true for years. What strikes me most about Delia isn't that she waited, it's how she waited. She didn't shrink. She didn't perform. She didn't make herself smaller or more convenient or easier to overlook. She showed up every single day as exactly who she was, capable, clear-eyed, a little dry in her humor, And she held something quietly inside all of it without letting the holding make her bitter. That takes a kind of inner honesty that most of us underestimate. It's easy to talk about patience. It's much harder to live with purpose and stay whole while you're practicing it. And Silas, I don't think he was careless. I think he was genuinely convinced, the way a lot of us are convinced about things we've never actually tested, that the distance between him and what he wanted was larger than it was. He had decided, without ever saying it out loud, that someone like Delia wasn't something a man like him reached for. That's not a small mistake. That's the kind of quiet, unexamined belief that can shape the entire course of a life if nobody comes along to name it. Frank Allard named it, and even then, it took Silas a few days to sit with it before he moved. That gap between understanding something and actually doing something about it is where I think most of us live most of the time. We know what we feel. We know what's true, and we find 100 reasonable-sounding reasons to wait one more week, one more season, until the conditions are a little more certain. Delia knew this too, which is why she finally said the true thing out loud on that dusty road, not as a last resort. As an act of clarity, she gave him a real chance, not a hint, not a door left barely open. The actual true thing, said plainly, and then she walked away and let him decide. What happened next followed naturally from who they both were. Silas had always been decent. He had always been the man who showed up with lumber he couldn't spare, who gave honest weight on the scale, who remembered what people needed. That character didn't appear on the morning he walked to her father's house in his clean shirt. It had been there for years. What changed was that he finally understood he was allowed to bring it to her. Decency, when it finally stops apologizing for itself, is not a small thing. And Delia's courage, the real kind, not the dramatic kind, was in saying the truth before she knew how it would land. That's the part I think about. Not the happy ending, which was earned and real. The moment before it. When she spoke and then walked away without waiting for his reaction, that's the moment the story turned on. Not on luck, not on perfect timing, on one person deciding that the truth was worth saying regardless of what came back. What almost didn't happen is what I hold on to. They were that close to a different story. One more week of Silas being certain that the mountains weren't for walking toward, and Leonard Hatch would have made his formal ask, and Delia, being the person she was, would eventually have moved forward. She had already decided she would. They chose each other at the last possible moment, and they meant every word of it. That's not a small thing either.